Okay, sorry about that. We got cut off there by accident. So where were we? We were just at the part where the holy people and the air spirit people had teamed up to make the first man and the first woman from corn. And then what happened after that is they realized there wasn't really any light in the sky. Now, the world was a lot brighter than the previous worlds. As they went up, they kept running into more and more ambient kind of light. But there was still a bit of a light problem. So the first man and the first woman, they created the sun and the moon. They sort of made them and painted them, and they put them in the sky. So the first humans have an important role to play in the creation myth as well. And after that, you don't really hear about the air spirit people very much. They kind of retire off to be locusts or something like that. And then the holy people remain important figures that the Navajo can call on and do frequently in their rituals. But that's pretty interesting that humanity is kind of taking over now. The air spirit people, these bug people, are less important. But then they're going to put some stars in the sky. But then along comes Coyote. And Coyote is a figure who exists in this world. And Coyote is often described as a trickster. He will try to get things to go his own way. And so he takes the stars and decides he's going to have the responsibility of putting them around. And he flings them randomly and haphazardly. So they're not in any organized way. And that's why when you look up at the sky, you see stars in all these random places because Coyote has just sort of thrown them all over the place because that's what he's like. And so that's a very good characterization for a coyote. It's a very good ideological myth. And there are similar stories with the story of Raven. There's a story of Raven who is particularly important for the northwestern cultures of the area of Oregon and of Alaska. In there, it's Raven who's the trickster, and Raven has a similar story about the rivers. He stole the rivers from another bird who was keeping them in his tent in his house, but he had to escape. And so he just kind of dropped the rivers haphazardly everywhere. So he dropped all this water in different places and became the great rivers of the world. And so that's why the rivers are scattered pretty randomly. So that's a kind of an interesting point of comparison. And it shows that the coyote and the raven are both these important figures in their respective creation myths. And tricksters like this are good for explaining why is the world so chaotic and random. So yeah, that's basically the core of the Navajo creation myth. The same sort of symbols appear in a lot of different rituals. The story mentions four mountains, which again correspond to the four colors and basically the four directions. And so when laying out one of these sacred rituals, you sort of reenact these four corners, and then the four corners are connected to the body of a person. So there's all these rituals that go along with this creation myth and with these kinds of general ideas that recur in Navajo culture. And the practice of sand painting also evokes these stories. And we have some images of from quite some time ago, 1902, masks that were used in ceremonies at that point, and are probably pretty similar to the masks that are still used by the Navajo people today, that they represent these types of figures, such as the talking god, who is one of these holy people who are the sort of gods that are called upon and the creators of human beings. Another one is the monster slayer, who also appears in rituals. And we don't have time to go into all the different rituals and all the different stories. I wish we could. But just know that there's a very visual, physical way of evoking these stories because people will put on these masks and take on the role of that particular god or mythological figure. And someone might be Coyote, for instance. So there's a very cool reenactment of the story that is a big part of how these stories are told. We shouldn't think of the Navajo having these stories written down in books. We should think of them as telling the stories in an oral tradition. And maybe the story changes. Maybe the story that was recorded for us is not quite the same story that other people know or that people knew back in 1902. And that's pretty interesting in itself because in oral storytelling tradition, things are changing all the time. But yeah, there's some interesting themes in this creation myth. For one thing, the world is sort of and we're going to talk about the biblical creation story, the book of Genesis and the Garden of Eden. There, the world is kind of a punishment for human beings. But here, even though they go through tragedy, even though they make errors like sleeping with other people's wives, um, the world is kind of a reward and an escape, because finally they're able to manage themselves, and they do it right this time, and they get to stay in the fourth world, with the kind of implication that if we're all too messed up, then we might lose our chance to stay in the fourth world. But yeah, here the world is a reward. And one of the important things about Native American creation myths is that usually people are seen as being within nature rather than somehow outside of it or supposed to control it. That's a theme we see is a sort of control over nature. Whereas here, we're living with the bug people. We are working with these sort of natural beings, and so we're on kind of an even playing field. That's the view of the world that the Navajo tradition presents, and a lot of Native American traditions present, which is really interesting. Yeah, let's see. Anything else I wanted to mention? Okay, I'm going to start talking about other Southwestern creation myths that are kind of comparable here. One of them is the Zuni emergence myth. And the Zuni are people who dwell particularly around the Zuni River, which is in Arizona and is a tributary of the Colorado River. So the Zuni story goes something like, human beings are not properly shaped. They're weird and blobby, and they live in a world that's very dark. Nobody can see each other, and they just are like really gross and bumping into each other all the time. That's basically how the story goes. Well, the sun, who may be the one who created the world in this story, he takes pity on these poor humans. So he sends his two children to help them, the elder brother and the younger brother. And these sons of the sun, they become the guides of human beings to get them to a better world and to make their lives better. So first, they lead human beings up into the other world, and they lead them through several different worlds, until finally they find one that's a good refuge for them. And also, another problem, one of the problems that human beings have is they have no mouths, so they can't eat. They have no anuses, so they can't poop. They have no fingers and toes, which is also, problematic. So the sons of the sun, they take out their knives and they start carving away at the human beings and carve them open a mouth hole and a butthole and so on and so forth. So they are shaping human beings like they're shaping a piece of wood. But it is sort of a disturbing image of having to cut a mouth in somebody. But apparently human beings also had horns and tails, so they were more like animals. And the sons of the sun made them more like people. So they helped in that way too. So the people become more like people until they're finally recognizable as people that we would know. And then the gods, the sons, lead them to a place called the middle of the world, which is where the Zuni end up settling. So the Zuni settle at the center point of the universe, which is something that occurs in a lot of mythic traditions, is your homeland is the center of the universe. In Greek mythology, that's the place of Delphi, where the oracle is. And there's a whole emphasis here, and in all these, on traditions, like that the gods or whoever the guides are teaching people how to do things and how to be, and that's the same teaching that is passed down to the children of the tribe. So that's pretty cool. Another great one from the same Southwestern tradition is Hopi mythology. In Hopi mythology, the sun god is named Tawa, and Tawa is very clearly the creator of the four worlds. He keeps creating the world and creating them over and over again. And again, we have this pattern of human beings emerging from underground into the next world that's built out around it.